The wind bit with teeth of ice, tearing at the threadbare remnants of their dresses. Alara huddled her daughters, Lily and Daisy, tighter against her, their small bodies trembling not just from the cold, but from the raw, exposed vulnerability of their scalps. The rough shears had scraped agony across skin already raw with humiliation. They had stood on the platform, the jeering faces a blur of hate, the cold steel a final, brutal severing from the life they had known, from the dignity that had been stripped piece by piece since Thomas died. Widow, they'd called her. Accursed. Too beautiful, too independent, too quick to inherit what some men thought belonged to them. And the twins, barely 7, caught in the wildfire of that cruelty simply for sharing her blood. Now, miles from the settlement, left with nothing but the tattered clothes on their backs and the stinging shame of their bare heads, the world felt vast and empty, a canvas of dying grass and skeletal trees under a bruised sky. This valley was rumored to be haunted, avoided by decent folk. A fitting place, they'd decided, for the indecent to perish. Fear was a physical weight in Alara's chest, pressing the air from her lungs. It wasn't just her own life she grieved for, but the fragile sparks flickering within her daughters. Lily, the more watchful, had not cried since they left the platform, her eyes wide and dark with shock. Daisy, usually the sunnier twin, burrowed into Alara's side, making small, whimpering sounds. They had walked until the last light bled from the sky, their feet raw, their hope a dwindling ember. Now, huddled beneath an overhang of rock that offered scant protection, the reality of their plight pressed in. No food, no water, the temperature dropping fast. Death felt less like a terrifying event and more like a slow, creeping numbness, an inevitability that the world had decreed. Alara buried her face in her daughter's thin, hairless heads, biting back a sob that tasted of dust and despair. How could she protect them from this? How could she fight the very air, the biting cold, the emptiness that stretched in every direction? As the last sliver of moon rose, painting the landscape in shades of silver and deep shadow, a sound carried on the wind. Not the howl of an animal, but the rhythmic thud of hooves. Alara's heart hammered. Was it someone from the settlement, come to ensure they were dead? Or something worse that lurked in these desolate lands? She pressed the girls behind her, a futile shield. The sound grew louder, closer. A single rider emerged from the darkness, a silhouette against the moon-bleached sky. He rode slowly, deliberately, his figure large and imposing even at a distance. He stopped a ways off, his horse snorting in the cold air. Alara couldn't make out his features in the gloom, only a dark shape atop a darker shape. He remained motionless for a long moment, observing them. Then slowly he dismounted. The sound of his boots on the frozen ground was starkly loud in the silence. He took a step towards them, then another. Alara braced herself, her body tensed, ready to flee or fight, though she had nothing to fight with. He stopped again, maybe 10 yards away. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low, rough-edged, and held no immediate threat, but also no warmth. "You'll freeze," he stated, a simple observation of undeniable fact. He made no move to approach further, simply stood there, a silent, still presence in the overwhelming desolation. Alara could only stare back, unable to form words around the lump of fear and exhaustion in her throat. He waited, the wind whipping his cloak around him. When she couldn't respond, he shifted slightly. "Got a cabin," he said, his gaze seeming to rest on the huddled forms of the children. "Ain't much, but it's dry. Got a fire." Alara was wary, too wary after what she'd endured. Men offering help often wanted something in return, something she had nothing left to give or protect. But the thought of fire, of dryness, of a brief reprieve from the gnawing cold for her daughters, it was a powerful lure. She searched his dark shape for any sign of malice, finding none, only a strange, watchful stillness. He didn't press, didn't approach closer. He simply stood and waited, an offer hanging in the frigid air. The silence stretched, broken only by the wind and the soft snorts of his horse. The decision felt impossible, yet utterly necessary. Survival, She realized with a cold clarity, demanded that she consider even the most unlikely hands offered in the darkness. Alara watched him. He hadn't moved, hadn't pressed. Just waited with a patience that felt as vast as the empty landscape. The memory of the faces, distorted by hate and self-righteousness, flashed in her mind. The cruelty they had inflicted was a fresh wound. Could she trust this stranger, emerging from the wilderness like a spirit of the rocks? Or was he simply another form of danger? But the whimpers from Daisy intensified, and Lily shivered violently beside her. The cold was a tangible enemy, immediate and relentless. The offer, however uncertain, promised warmth, a brief defiance against the elements determined to claim them. She looked at the outline of his horse, steady and calm. She looked back at him, still unmoving. There was no predatory tension in his stance, only that quiet, almost sorrowful observation. Swallowing hard, Alara finally found her voice. It was hoarse, barely a whisper. We have nothing. Didn't ask for nothing, he replied, his voice still low. He slowly turned his horse, mounted it with an economy of movement, and sat looking back at them for a moment. Then, without another word, he turned the animal and began to ride slowly back the way he came, disappearing into the shadows. He expected them to follow. It was an act of trust on his part, or perhaps simply indifference to their choice. Either way, it shifted the burden of decision back to her. Stay and face certain death in the cold, or follow a silent stranger into the unknown. With a surge of fierce, protective resolve, Alara tightened her grip on her daughter's hands. "Come," she murmured, her voice gaining a fraction of strength. We follow the horse slowly, stiffly. They rose and began to walk, their eyes fixed on the faint trace left by his retreating figure. The air remained frigid, the future uncertain, but a flicker of something other than despair had ignited within her the faint, fragile light of possibility. He rode at a pace that allowed them to keep his horse in sight, a dark shape moving like a shadow across the moonlit terrain. He never looked back, never urged them faster. It felt less like being led and more like being accompanied by a silent, unyielding presence. After what felt like an age, they saw a faint glow in the distance. Smoke rose lazily against the night sky. His cabin was small, nestled against a rise in the land, built of rough-hewn logs. It looked sturdy, lived in. He dismounted as they approached, tied his horse, and went to the door, opening it without waiting. Warm air, thick with the smell of wood smoke and something else, stew, spilled out. He stepped aside, gesturing them in with a brief nod. Hesitantly, Alara led the girls inside. The heat was a shock after the biting cold, wrapping around them like a warm blanket. A small fire crackled merrily in a stone hearth. The cabin was simple. A cot covered in furs, a rough table and 2 stools, shelves holding few possessions, and a cooking pot hanging over the fire. The man moved with quiet purpose, adding another log to the fire. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a weathered face and eyes that seemed perpetually narrowed, perhaps against the sun or the harshness of his life. He wore simple buckskin clothes. His name, she learned later, was Silas. He didn't ask them about their heads, or where they came from, or why they were alone in the wilderness. He simply ladled some stew from the pot into 3 wooden bowls and placed them on the table. The smell was intoxicating. He poured them water from a bucket. Then he sat on one of the stools, watching them with those quiet, assessing eyes as they ate. Alara ate slowly, cautiously, but the girls devoured the stew, their small hands clumsy with the spoons. Silas ate from his own bowl standing by the hearth, his back mostly to them. He gave off an aura of self-sufficiency, of deep solitude. After they finished, he gestured to a pile of furs near the fire. "Sleep there," he said. He offered no platitudes, no false kindness, just simple, necessary provision. Alara settled the girls onto the furs. They were soft, warm, a luxury after the frozen ground. Exhaustion claimed them almost instantly. Alara lay between them, feeling the warmth seep into her chilled bones. She watched Silas. He sat by the fire for a long time, sharpening a knife with a stone, his movements steady and focused. He was a man of the wilderness, solitary and quiet. What did he want? Why had he helped them? The questions lingered, unanswered. But for the first time in days, the crushing weight of immediate despair had lifted, replaced by a cautious, fragile hope. She drifted into a restless sleep, the crackling fire and the silent man her only guardians against the night. The days that followed were a study in quiet cohabitation. Silas continued his routine, hunting, trapping, mending gear. He spoke little, but his actions were consistent. He provided food, kept the fire going, ensured they had water. He didn't hover, didn't demand conversation. He gave them space, a respect for their trauma that Alara found herself clinging to. She began to move around the cabin, helping with small tasks, sweeping, washing the few dishes. The girls, after the initial shock wore off, began to explore their surroundings within the confines of the cabin and the small clearing outside. Lily remained quiet and observant, while Daisy, with the resilience of childhood, started to regain some of her natural buoyancy, even attempting shy smiles at Silas, which he would acknowledge with a brief, almost imperceptible nod. Alara watched him, studied him. He was competent, capable, utterly at home in the harsh environment. He knew the land, the weather patterns, the habits of the animals. There was a deep sadness in his eyes sometimes, a loneliness that mirrored her own, though born of different circumstances. He was a widower. She knew that now, though he hadn't spoken of his loss. It was in the way he moved through his solitary life, the quiet order of his small cabin, the absence of any personal effects that spoke of another person. He seemed content in his solitude, yet he had brought them in. She wondered about his past, about the woman he had loved, but the questions remained unspoken between them. Her own strength began to return. The physical toll of the exposure and the emotional weight of the shaming had left her weak, but food and warmth slowly nourished her body and spirit. She found herself observing Silas's methods, learning about the rhythm of survival in this place. He didn't offer to teach, but if she watched, if she was near, he didn't object. She learned to prepare the game he brought back, to stretch their meager supplies. The baldness of her scalp was a constant, stinging reminder, a physical manifestation of her vulnerability. But in this cabin, under Silas's silent watch, the shame began to recede, replaced by a fierce determination not just to survive, but to stand on her own feet. One evening, as a storm howled outside, shaking the cabin, Silas was sharpening his knife by the firelight. Alara sat across from him, mending a tear in Lily's dress with a needle and thread she'd found in a small tin box on a shelf. The girls slept soundly on the furs. The silence was comfortable now, not empty. "Why did you help us?" she finally asked, her voice low, not wanting to break the quiet too harshly. He paused his work, looking into the fire. "Saw you," he said simply. "Saw the children. Knew you wouldn't last. Most folk would have left us," she pressed gently. "Considered us trouble." He shrugged, his gaze still on the flames. "Maybe," he allowed. He looked up then, meeting her eyes across the fire. "Saw the look in your eyes. Didn't look like trouble. Looked like you'd already had more than your share." He returned to his sharpening, but the quiet statement hung in the air. He had seen past the shaven heads, past the mark of their public condemnation, and seen the raw hurt, the desperation, the resilience that lay beneath. It was a profound recognition, a validation she hadn't realized she craved. In that moment, something shifted irrevocably between them. It was no longer just about survival. It was about a shared understanding, a quiet kinship forged in the crucible of hardship. The storm raged outside, but inside the small cabin, a different kind of warmth began to grow. The winter deepened, wrapping the cabin in a shroud of white and bitter cold. Survival became a daily struggle, demanding vigilance and cooperation. The tentative trust between Alara and Silas solidified into a quiet, unspoken partnership. He relied on her to manage the domestic sphere, to stretch their dwindling supplies, to care for the girls. She relied on him for protection, for the skills needed to wrest sustenance from the unforgiving land. Alara found a strength within herself she never knew existed. She learned to set snares under Silas's silent guidance, her fingers growing numb in the cold but her resolve firm. She learned to read the signs of the weather, to listen to the subtle warnings of the wilderness. Her bare scalp, once a source of burning shame, was now covered by a simple wool cap Silas had given her, a practical necessity rather than a symbol of her past. The girls, though still thin and quiet, began to thrive under the consistent care and the presence of a steady, reliable figure in Silas. They helped collect firewood, their small hands clumsy but eager. They chattered quietly to each other, their laughter a rare, precious sound in the cabin. Silas, though never overtly affectionate, showed them kindness in small ways, carving simple wooden toys, sharing a piece of dried fruit. He had built a life of solitude, perhaps believing that was his fate, but the presence of the three of them had softened the hard edges of his existence. The threat, when it came, was not from the people who had cast them out, but from the land itself. A blizzard descended, fierce and relentless, trapping them in the cabin for days. The snow piled high, burying their snares, making hunting impossible. Their stored food dwindled rapidly. The temperature plummeted. The fire, their lifeline, consumed wood faster than they had anticipated. Anxiety gnawed at Alara. She saw it mirrored in Silas's usually stoic face, a subtle tension around his eyes. On the third day of the blizzard, the firewood was dangerously low. "Gotta get more," Silas said, his voice grim. The snow was chest-deep outside, the wind a roaring beast. It was a perilous task. "I'll go with you," Alara said immediately. Silas looked at her, his gaze assessing. "It's hard going. Dangerous." "I know," she replied, her voice firm. "But two can gather faster than one. And I won't stay here waiting for the fire to die." There was no trace of the frightened, helpless woman he had found. Her eyes met his, steady and determined. After a moment, he nodded. They bundled up in their warmest few layers. Silas went first, breaking trail through the deep snow, his powerful frame pushing against the drifts. Alara followed, the going arduous, every step a struggle. The wind tore at them, whipping snow into their faces, blinding them. But they worked together, finding buried logs, snapping branches, hauling them back to the cabin. It was backbreaking labor in the brutal cold. Alara pushed past exhaustion, past the burning in her lungs and muscles, driven by the knowledge of the two small lives depending on the fire. They made several trips, each one an ordeal. As darkness began to fall, painting the snowscape in shades of gray and blue, they hauled the last load back. They were covered in snow, numb with cold, but the woodpile was replenished. Inside, the girls huddled near the dying embers. Alara stumbled to the hearth, her hands shaking, and fed the new wood to the fire. It caught slowly at first, then roared to life, pushing back the cold, filling the cabin with its golden light and blessed warmth. They sank onto the floor near the fire, too exhausted to stand. Silas looked at Alara, his expression unreadable for a moment, then a flicker of something, respect, appeared in his eyes. "You did good," he said, his voice rough with fatigue. "We did good," she corrected softly, looking at the fire, the sleeping children, then back at him. The partnership was complete. They had faced the wilderness, not just separately, but together, relying on each other's strength. They had built not just a fire against the cold, but a fragile, fierce bond against the world's cruelty. The blizzard still raged, but within the small cabin, illuminated by the dancing flames, there was a sense of hard-won victory, of a future they were determined to build, together, piece by painstaking piece. The blizzard eventually broke, revealing a world transformed, covered in a pristine, deep blanket of snow under a brilliant, cold sun. Survival remained a challenge, but the immediate crisis had forged an unbreakable link between Alara, her daughters, and Silas. They were no longer a man living alone and the woman and children he had rescued. They were a unit, bound by shared hardship and mutual reliance. Alara's hair began to grow back, a soft, downy fuzz at first, then thicker, darker strands that covered the raw places. It was a physical manifestation of her healing, a reclaiming of what had been so brutally taken. She no longer felt the need to hide her head. The scar of that day was now a symbol of what she had overcome. Silas, always a man of few words, communicated his commitment through his presence and his actions. He taught Alara to track, to hunt with a rifle, skills vital for their long-term survival. He built a small, sturdy sled to haul supplies. He spoke of planning for the spring, talking not of his own plans, but of their plans, including Alara and the girls seamlessly into his future. The cabin, once a place of solitary refuge, now held the warmth of shared lives, the small sounds of the girls' games, the quiet rhythm of two adults working in concert. The world outside the valley still held potential threats, the judgment of others, the harsh realities of frontier life. But they had built a sanctuary here, not just of logs and stone, but of trust and resilience. Alara knew that the people who had shamed her, who had left her and her daughters to die, would likely never know that she had survived, that she had found strength not in bitterness, but in forging a new path, supported by an unlikely ally. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues, Alara stood outside the cabin, watching Silas mend a fence post damaged by the storm. The girls were inside, humming softly. Her hair was still short, but it was undeniably growing, a crown of defiance against the past. Silas looked up and met her gaze across the clearing. There was no need for words. The understanding was complete. They were two people, broken by loss and cruelty, who had found each other in the desolate places and built something new, something strong, from the ruins. Life here was hard, marked by physical labor and constant vigilance. But it was also real, stripped bare of the petty cruelties and false civility of the settlement. Here, worth was measured in competence, in resilience, in the quiet act of caring for one another. Alara had come to this valley as a victim, stripped bare and left for dead. She had found shelter with a solitary man who asked for nothing but offered everything that mattered: safety, respect, and the space to heal and grow. She was no longer just a widow, no longer just the woman they had shamed. She was a survivor, a provider, a partner. The journey from that freezing, shameful night to this moment had been long and arduous, marked by fear, uncertainty, and the slow, painstaking work of building trust. But standing there, watching the man who had saved them, who had become their anchor, Alara felt a profound sense of peace, not the absence of struggle, but the quiet confidence of knowing she was no longer alone. They had been cast out, left for dead, but they had found life, and each other, in the wilderness. And that, she knew with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, was a victory no one could ever take away. The scars remained, etched onto their memories and the physical reminder of her hair, but they were no longer marks of shame. They were testaments to resilience, to the enduring power of human connection in the face of inhumanity, and to the quiet strength found in the most unexpected places.